Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Wednesday, which means it's time for another production basic lesson. Also, my EP came out today. It's called The R is Silent. It's on pretty much every platform, including Spotify, and iTunes, and Google Play, and Amazon, and all that. And Beatport, presumably. So, go get it if you haven't. Please. Anyway, I'm here today to talk to you about stereo. Controlling stereo and creating stereo and mixing stereo and the importance of stereo and controlling stereo images and stereo fields and what that means. And then we also kind of talk about mid and side because that's a fun concept. So stereo, what does stereo mean? Stereo is in reference to the typical listening and playback setup of any kind of, sound system, which usually involves two speakers, a left and a right. You can have more, and increasingly so, like theaters and people with TVs and headphones even have more than stereo. They'll have like 5.1 or 7.1, or they'll use crazy algorithms to fake it with only two speakers to create the illusion of 5.1, and they're still utilizing stereo to accomplish that. We'll talk a little bit about how that works too. The idea of stereo versus mono is that we have mono, where a signal is being played evenly through both channels. This can be you can see this represented if you look at the mixer, if you're in FL. In most DAWs, you can look at the metering of whatever you're playing through, and you'll see two bars, or in the case of mono, it looks kind of like one bar that's bisected for some reason. This is because when you're playing something in mono, this means that that signal is evenly represented in both the left and the right. It's so even, in fact, that it doesn't sound like it's coming from one speaker, but that's coming from some sort of middle generation in between you if it's set up properly. That sounded kind of weird on my system, but whatever. You can see how that's sort of a representation of the idea of stereo. It's a very basic concept, but when people talk about stereo, they often are they're referring to things like, okay, well, I have something that's mono, but I want to make it stereo. What's the benefit of making something a stereo? Well, let's take something that's pretty rich sounding, like a saw wave. There is a Sorry, I saw something in the chat. I just woke up. I apologize. There's a thing called the super saw. One of the aspects of the super saw is that we utilize unison to make it sound like that. This is what happens when we layer a whole bunch of saws with different pitch, different phases. But one other aspect is that we are able to change panning. This is when we alter the panning setting of each of these 9 voices to be evenly spread across both sides. And we get this much wider, bigger feeling. And you can see in the levels being output by the DAW that the left and the right are average. They average to be similar, but they're not the same. They're constantly changing. This gives us the impression of width, because remember how we defined mono as being something that sounds like it's coming from the center of your field when you're listening, when something is being evenly represented by both speakers, and then things sound like they're on the sides of your field when it has information that's only unique to one speaker or the other. That, by the way, is the definition of mid and side. When you see a plugin that has mid or side, like mid-side EQ, mid-side compression, that kind of thing, this is, or mid-side reverb even, that's what that means. It means that the mid is the middle, as information that is shared between both speakers to sound like it's presented in the center. And there's a side, which is information that is unique to either the left or the right speaker, which gives us the impression of stereo width. And in fact, in FL, there is a direct mid-side control. That's this guy right here on each mixer. Really what this is a fader between mid and side. So for this particular sound, which has a lot of panning and a lot of width to it, if I were to turn it all the way this way, this is the information that's from that sound that is shared between these two speakers, these two channels, the mid. And here's on the side the information that is unique to either the left or the right, which can feel kind of weird. The stereo shaper here, this plugin, accomplishes shaping the stereo in various different ways. I have this here because this is pretty handy for either creating stereo and something that's not stereo, or controlling the stereo something that is. Sometimes it can get kind of a little intense. The parameters that we have listed here, we have these faders. We have positive and negative polarity for left and right, but we have sort of doubles for either left and right. This is so that we can use phase cancellation against itself, that kind of thing. I'm assuming you know what phase cancellation is because that was the very first thing that I talked about in the Production Basics series. So I'm not going to mention that again. We also have delay and phase. Now, this delay concept is actually very, very popular in creating stereo in anywhere. So here's our regular saw wave again. We'll play a bass this time, just make it more obvious. This delay idea is referred to as the Haas effect. I don't know, Haas effect. And what you're doing is that while the same signal is going through left and right, you're going to delay the audio in either the left or the right. And this creates stereo where once there was none. Now, for something really solid and really clear, like a saw wave, it doesn't really work very well because what this will do is it'll make it lean one way or the other. In fact, you can kind of see in the vector scope, one side is kind of louder than the other, but the one is sort of unevenly farther away from center than this one guy is. But we have other options. That was random. So we have the various faders or whatever. We also have this phase concept, which allows us to kind of try and balance out the results. What I'm looking for when I try to control the stereo field of something is that it has width, but it has a definable center. And that definable center is the actual center. It's actually in the middle of something. Nothing bugs me more than having something that's stereo width, but leaning one side or the other. And the Haas effect very, very much so does that. But you can kind of control that with these faders. Through the use of adding in channels into the other channel and then using phase cancellation from polarity, or even just turning down one side or the other, you can kind of try and balance that. The Haas effect is very finicky. Another way to kind of add stereo to something that doesn't have stereo is the idea of reverb. Again, here's a nice mid-side control, a reverb. Here's even a mid-side application, which is to say it'll reverb the mid channel or it'll reverb the side channel. The side information, I guess I should say, since the channels are just left and right. Notice when I switch to side, nothing happens because the original signal has no side. It's just a mono saw wave. Reverbs do a good job of blurring an original signal and kind of introducing a little bit of stereo width, although it is a very particular kind of stereo, and it's again, not as well controlled as sort of the Haas effect is. And then there's also the idea of unison that we were doing earlier. But as you see, too much of it changes the underlying character of the sound, of the original sound. So you can sort of futz around with that concept to sort of have a balance for things. If you don't want to use it as unison or cannot use unison because it's a sound source that doesn't have that ability, well, you can still use it because you can render it out as audio and then do it yourself manually. But just, if you don't want to do that for some reason. Other plugins, things like choruses, have a similar but just slightly different effect on a sound like that. There are also a lot of plugins out there that are like their whole job in their life is to create stereo where there once was none. One in particular is called Acoustics. It might be the company name. It was recommended to me by BT. I used it a couple times. It's pretty alright. It's pretty CPU intensive and a little intense, but it does very controlled versions of things that we've just done, and algorithmically they try and create even feeling stereo feel, but even it will still mangle a very solid original signal like just a naked saw wave to make it sound stereo, because some sounds just don't have stereo in the way that you'd want. Now let's talk about the vector scope and what it does. So here I've got a sine wave. This is what a completely mono signal looks like in the vector scope. And we can see we have these markings on the side here. We have positive right, positive left, and negative right. I've been thinking, what's all this positive and negative stuff about? Well, this has to do with just straight up the oscillations of waveforms. If I went to the oscilloscope side, we can see the measurement of a waveform's oscillation, and you can see that it goes positive and negative, which I did talk about this before as well, but I'm going to remind you just so that you don't have to go watch the waveform basics video again. So the vector scope measures where the signal is going to go in its positive and negative oscillations. In the case of a perfectly mono sine wave, it only goes, straight up and straight down, which is to say it has even distribution of left and right, positive and negative. But if I were to add in, say, some unison, suddenly we get this. Now, two things are happening. One, we're introducing a little bit of actual stereo here, and you can see it's kind of moving in and out a bit. Now it's moving, what we're actually looking at is that the signal is spinning around the interface really fast. It looks like a solid ring, but really what's happening is that it's doing this really fast. It's going left, right, up and down, left, right, up and down, left, right, up and down, that kind of thing really fast. It's a two-axis sort of gyroscopic spin. The flattening and on either axis business is kind of interesting, because what's happening is that in order to create unison, we're detuning the waveform. And if we detune the waveform, this means that we've created phase cancellation. So what's happening right now is that this phase cancellation is alternating between mid and side. Right now it's all mid, and right now it's all side. So that's what all side looks like. All mid. And then apparently a lot more side, but not necessarily all side. If you want to look at true all mid and all side, the stereo shaper can actually help you with this. There's a thing you can do. Or actually you can do this with Patcher because it's a lot easier to visualize. Stereo shaper, another one. Actually, I need another one. It's okay. So outputs. Send one, I think is what I want to do. Yeah, so, and I don't particularly know why this happens, but if you set all these guys on like this, like sort of halfway up, and then set the in-out difference to be a particular output, now it's separated to be either mid or side. I hate it when this happens. All right, there we go. Just to separate them. So here's all side. As you see, it's flat in the vector scope. Here's all mid. It's also flat, but now it's vertical. You might kind of be able to hear that the emphasis now. It doesn't sound like the sound's coming from left or right. It sounds like it's coming from on, like in the sides of your ears, which is kind of weird. Now, let's try a different sound. This is a triangle wave, and now the vector scope is a square. What's up with that? Well, the vector scope, as it is a measurement of amplitude, just, you know, in the context of stereo, is still going to have a shape that's relative to the original waveform. So now we have introduced corners into the mix. Now, here's what's fun about the saw wave. A saw wave's construction is such that it has the waveform that goes down, and then it immediately snaps back up. So I mean, that's why we're getting these two kind of separated sections of waveform. And the square wave is even more interesting. Now, very rarely when you're like looking at a song inside Wave Candy like this, will you see a very that well-defined a shape. In fact, let's look at one. Let's look at a track from my EP, for example. Like Fireflies. Let's listen to that. That's reasonable. Reasonable amount right there. There's my voice, which leans in kind of not in a straight line, because even though I'm supposed to be mono, my interface and the mixer I'm using and the inputs all kind of collude to make it unbalanced for some reason. So what you were seeing there is that when a whole track is run through a thing, the whole track kind of has a total amount of stereo field. At an individual sound level, creating stereo can be kind of a pain in the ass, but at the end of the day, it's all about mixing it all together so that everything sounds like it fits in its own stereo field. And it's all about averages. It's all about the idea that, sure, there's a lot going on left and right, but it still adds together to be mono. And it's a certain, not literally mono, but like, you know what I mean? You can see it. Even some of the parts where it sort of distilled into individual sounds and got closer and closer to being flat, and then something would happen, and then it would kind of get wider, that kind of thing. But it was always an even amount of width. It never leaned one way or the other. It was always even. That kind of thing. That's a result that you want out of your track. And doing that is very much an exercise of by ear. It's very much listen to it, feel how it's balanced, and also making damn sure that your speakers are even. An easy way to do that is to listen to it in mono and see where center is. And if your center is actually in the middle of your speakers, then you're good. But yeah, so that's kind of, I don't actually use vector scopes to look at things, from my own perspective. I use it usually to look at other people's stuff. I'm using a vector scope now to kind of explain sort of stereo and how the signal works, that kind of thing. So as far as actually, mixing and mastering and for stereo and mono, that kind of thing, one thing that pops up a lot is the idea that you want to keep certain frequencies below a certain point mono, or at least less stereo. There's a lot of ways to go about doing that. The way that I particularly prefer is to utilize Maximus, because it has this button right there, which, as you can see, has the exact same little icon on it as this guy over here, because it does the same thing. It is a mid and side fade, and you have one on each individual band. So if I do it all the way this way, it's now mono. It's now side, or mid, rather. This is very different. Mid and side fading, by the way, is very different than stereo collapsing, which is to say that you have your right and your left channel, and then you just clone it on either side. That would be as if we took the stereo shaper here, and instead of phase canceling it so that's either the mid or the side and that kind of thing, we're just turning on the channel and both channels into both channels, which will sound very different. The distinction is important because when you go to play a track live on a big system in a huge, place or whatever, if you're that kind of DJ, those systems are pretty much universally mono. And I mean, some of them might be stereo, but it's kind of really hard to do stereo in an environment like that. Especially because if you have a big enough crowd, there's going to be people on the far left or far right who are only going to get the far right or the far left. And that's not going to work out very well for them in terms of actually listening to the music. I can tell you this because on mixers, one thing that's pretty common is that if you want to run a single in mono, they take the left channel. And when I was in high school, I played some music. It wasn't my music, but I played Mahavishnu Orchestra over the speakers, and it was a track where they had a lot of solo duels. And the way that they kind of mixed stereo back in the day is that they kind of viewed left and right as not necessarily being a pair, but as being two individual channels. And they would do things like pan whole instruments to either not like double tracking, but like literally the entire thing only ever stayed on one side. And this would mean that I would play the left mono signal through the the stage PA in my high school, and I would miss half the solos because the solo would be on either the left or the right. And so you would only hear the reverb from the right, and it was weird. That's what happens when you do take one channel mono. And what would happen theoretically to listeners who are in a live environment that were only on one side of the stage or the other. So that's why it's usually in mono. This is an important consideration because a lot of people tend to go pretty ham on their stereo field because it does sound pretty dope, especially when you're on headphones and it's very particular, that kind of thing. But the issue with that is if it's too stereo, that means like it's too wide. And the only way that's really ever going to happen is that the left and the right get more and more distinct from one another. The more distinct they get, the higher the chances that when you collapse them together, which is not to say mix the mid, but to collapse them together, the cloning way that we showed with the stereo shaper, you're going to phase cancel those channels. They're going to, especially if you're doing it with bass. And if you do that, you're going to lose a lot of frequencies. I remember one time there was a tweet from Rob Swire who was saying that if he collapses your track into mono and you lose everything above 300 hertz, you're doing it wrong. And that's just kind of that's just a funny thing that can happen, and you want to avoid that. You might want to do different mixes for heavy mono or stereo, that kind of thing. And this, as a result, means that a lot of people, especially when they're making this kind of music that they design for playing live, will actually mix the track in mono before they go and try and make a stereo. I don't do that, but you can do that. It's viable. It's a thing you can do. That kind of thing. But you might be thinking, well, you still haven't really answered the question of like, how do you make something that's mono and turn it into stereo and do it well? Because I've shown you a bunch of individual ways that don't really add up to doing it particularly amazingly. And the answer to that question is, it's a combination of all of that. It's never going to be the same sort of answer depending on the sound, and it's always going to be kind of like a balance, because not only do you have to make it sound, reasonably fine and balanced by itself, but it's got to sound that way mixed with everything else. And just like EQing, you're going to have those considerations when everything else is playing together. This is often why people use a lot of white noise on their track, because white noise is inherently different from everything and random and perfectly, different from itself even. So it's wide. And if you layer that in with anything, you're going to make it sound bigger. So that's particularly why that ends up happening. So let's see. Do I need to talk about anything else? I covered, I think, just about everything I wanted to cover in terms of stereo. As far as like when to use it and on what instrument to use it, that is 100% up to you. There's not really a standard. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a common thing lots of people do, but I mean, experiment. The monoing on the low end is pretty important, though. That's important stuff, because you don't want phase cancellation on your bass. Yeah. So if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.